Hey class, thanks for joining in. Sorry I didn't get this to you earlier and that I wasn't in class, but I was down in West Kentucky, the Jackson Purchase area, seeing my mother and father who live in Palma, which is between Paducah and Benton, Kentucky. Well, hopefully you enjoyed the review online that you did. I think Mrs. Kelly showed you a couple of YouTube videos that were about 10 minutes long. I'm going to try to do about a 10-minute video to review federalism and explain to you how the whole discussion of federalism plays into these Alien and Sedition Acts and the Kentucky resolutions. So I'm going to take you to your handout that I gave for federalism versus anti-federalism, and it had that picture of it looked like some old guys in an official building there. So if you have that with you, grab it. If not, pause, go get it, because I want to point out the specific points that the Federalists and the Anti-federalists presented in their argument for the type of government that would be established. Okay, remember in class we talked about a constitution. We talked about how something is constituted or made up. This is a legal document which created an agreement between a group of states. So we're talking about the formation of the Constitution of the United States of America, or that document which declares what this nation will be. So there was this big argument, you've read it, there was this big discussion between those who were Federalists and those who were Anti-federalists. Now, if you're from my generation, you've heard several trilogy movies come out, and it would be like in Star Wars or possibly some of the other science fiction movies. They would have the Federation. And a federation is a group of people who are federated together. You'll remember during the Civil War, they became the Confederate States of America, or those states who were confederated together. So the Federalists were for a strong, uniting document. They wanted a constitution which gave a lot of power to the states as they were united. The Anti-federalists, on the other hand, wanted to make sure that each state maintained a significant amount of power, more power than this broad federal government. So that's your basic argument that's going on. I'm going to read the bulleted points to you about federalism. The Anti-federalists, by the way, you'll see very soon that this would be the position that most Kentuckians would take, thought it gave too much power to the national government at the expense of state governments. That was the primary complaint. But also, they complained that there was no Bill of Rights that specifically laid out the rights of individuals against this constituted government. Number 3, the national government could maintain an army in peacetime. Anytime a government could maintain an army, there was always the possibility that they could use that army as a means to suppress the people. Congress had too much power. And number 5, the executive branch held too much power. So they thought Congress had too much power, and they thought that the president himself had too much power. Unfortunately, what we're seeing in our day and time is actually now the court has transitioned and has usurped and taken more power. They've become actively passing judgment in ways that almost creates new laws. So the Anti-federalists, which by the way, as I said, Kentucky would have taken that position, was opposed to a strong confederated government or a strong federal government simply because it would take power over states and over individual rights. Now, the Federalists, on the other hand, had a couple of things that they argued. Number 1, the separation of powers into 3 independent branches protected the rights of the people. So what they said was, well, we have 3 different types three different branches to one government, and so they will balance each other. And so we should be fairly safe. That was one of their arguments. A second argument they made about the Bill of Rights was once you begin to list rights, then who's to say you have any other rights if they're not listed? And so they argued against the Bill of Rights because they, in effect, believed that it would really limit, or at least they made that argument that it would limit the rights of individuals. Okay, so that's sort of the background of a long-standing discussion in our government. It goes on today. Even now, conservatives are more inclined to promote policies and programs that limit government. I guess they wouldn't even be promoting programs. They would try to limit programs and promote policy that would cut government back. While a liberal government would, or liberals would want to promote stronger, larger government programs. So that's the backdrop. Now, in chapter 61, or in chapter 10, page 61, an interesting thing is presented, and it's called the Alien and Sedition Laws. If you have your book, turn there. Here's Henry Clay, and over on this side of the book, you'll see in the little box there, Alien and Sedition Laws. Very simply, the Alien and Sedition Laws were laws passed by Congress that gave strong power to the president himself. This allowed the president to incarcerate any individual who spoke against the government. There were about 15 or so people who were actually incarcerated for things that they were saying against the then president. And then in addition to the Sedition Act, there was the Alien Act, which basically said that the government, more specifically the president, was able to extradite or ship out of the country any alien that they felt was dangerous to our country. So Kentuckians, having just become a state in 1792, this bill was passed in 1798. Kentuckians were livid. A young man had just come to Kentucky, and his name was Henry Clay. We're going to hear a lot about Henry Clay in the future chapters, right up until 1950. But here at the beginning of the century, Henry Clay is 21 years old. He's just come to Kentucky, and I'm going to read you what he says as the Kentuckians are discussing these Alien and Sedition Acts. He was lifted into a cart from which proud eminence he poured forth such denunciations of the act of Congress as won the admiration and satisfaction of his high-wrought audience. So, Henry Clay, one of the first things he did while he was getting his law practice started here was to speak out on this issue and to incite people against these Alien and Sedition Acts, and really, again, against this strong federal government. Well, the Alien and Sedition Acts were passed, and Kentuckians were extremely opposed. And there was another gentleman, if you'll turn the page, right in the middle of the page, right here, I'm going to put it up close so you may be able to see it online, Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson was a younger man, middle-aged man, over in Virginia, which really, we had been part of Virginia until just 5 or 6 years previously. And so we had a lot of strong ties. And so, actually, Thomas Jefferson is the one who was the architect or the writer of what you see at the top of page 62, the Kentucky Resolutions of 1798. Basically, what these resolutions do is they say, wait a minute, we did not sign up for a strong federal government that could run our state. How can you come and tell people from other countries that they can't be in Kentucky? And how can you come just because we might say something against the president and shut our mouth? And so the actual document was prepared by Thomas Jefferson, but it was presented by a delegation from Kentucky. So here are the 4 primary points in the Kentucky resolutions, and you have that handout as well. And we presented these, well, we adopted them on November 10th. Okay? Number 1, and I'm not going to read the whole document because it's pretty wordy, but number 1, it says that we signed up to be part of a general government for special purposes. In other words, we didn't give raw, unbridled power to the federal government. We have a general government for special purposes. And we have defined what those purposes are, and the government should not take any more power. Number 2, it says that the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution are reserved to the states respectively, or to the people. In other words, if we didn't give you the power still belongs to the states. And number 3, again, it goes back to the Constitution, and it says if it's not declared by one of the amendments, then the powers not delegated to the United States are prohibited by it. It goes on to say that those framers of the Constitution, or the ones who signed the Constitution, remained or kept their right to decide what kind of freedom of the press they would allow, what kind of free speech they would allow. In other words, if somebody wants to speak out against the President of the United States here in Kentucky, it's up to us to decide if it's in such a way that it's going to incite a revolution or rebellion. In number 3, they include part of the Constitution which says Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. And then they really cry out to the First Amendment, which gives the right to free speech. And then number 4, it says that, again, that foreigners who are friends, or aliens who are friends, are under the jurisdiction and protection. So you can see this Alien and Sedition Act stirred back up in the Kentuckians their understanding that we really do not need a strong federal government which tries to govern every aspect of our life. You'll notice there where it talked about federalism, the first president was George Washington. He was a Federalist. And the second president of the United States, John Adams, was also a Federalist. Now, our friend Thomas Jefferson was elected as the 3rd president of the United States of America, and this very situation, the Alien Sedition Acts, that played a big part in Thomas Jefferson being elected. They really used this to say, hey, do we want a monarch? Do we want the federal government to have this power to rule over us? And so Thomas Jefferson was elected, and supposedly, supposedly he would have been promoting a smaller government. However, there's a couple of things he did, which we'll talk about later, that sort of went against his anti-federalist writings from earlier on. Turn over to page 62. You're probably already there, and you'll see a small section, and it's entitled The Doctrine of States' Rights. And this is where I want to end up. The whole idea of federalism versus anti-federalism, as I said, goes on to this very day. The issue of gun control, the issue of the environment, the issue of the government getting involved in overly supporting the indigent at the cost of higher taxes. Those are all federalist, anti-federalist ideas, and a doctrine began to evolve very early on. It was called the Doctrine of State Rights. I'm going to read that section to you. This doctrine is as follows. the several states composing the United States of America are not united in submission to their general government, that the general government was created by a compact of the several states, each state agreeing thereto, and yet reserving to itself the right to its own self-government, that the government created by this compact is not made the final judge of the powers delegated to it, that as each state is a party to the compact, therefore each state has an equal right to judge for itself, as well of infractions as of the mode and measure of redress. And so the whole idea is that in this first foray between the Federalists and the Anti-federalists, Kentucky really took the side of the Anti-federalists, and we really promoted this idea of states' rights, that we should not be held to anything that was not originally any power that was not originally given to the federal government. They should not be able to exercise over us. So I just wanted to go back through these several documents and mention Thomas Jefferson and Henry Clay, because now we're going to talk about a lot of things that have to do with governmental policy. We've talked about how the government was structured. Now we see some of the political factions, or the two sides that are beginning to form. So thank you very much for being patient with me to get this to you, and hopefully you'll be able to read back through that chapter, at least the sections that apply. On to chapter 11 and 12, there's way too much there for us to cover. We're going to just push through it. We'll talk about Tecumseh in class, and the causes which led to the War of 1812. But other than that, we won't mention a lot out of those two chapters. And then I think we have just 2 or 3 more chapters, yes, before we get to the Civil War. Yes, chapter 14 will be the Civil War. So we're going to try to buzz through the rest of this. It's interesting if you stop and go very, very slow, but we don't have time to do that. So we're going to look at the life of Henry Clay up to about 1950, War of 1812, the Mexican War, and then we'll march toward that most terrible war, the war between the states.